So then a big and very warm hello, and then welcome everyone to this very important and timely conversation. My name is John Ackerly. I am co-founder and CEO of Virtru, a data privacy and protection company based out of Washington, D.C. We are honored to be co-hosting this conversation with the Atlantic Council, focused on practical tools and the implications of the Biden administration's the May 12th executive order about how we can better protect our private and public sector networks from then cyber attacks. And I would just say that, at Virtru, we definitely try to avoid fear, uncertainty, and doubt in terms of how we talk about the challenges. Our mission is actually, how do you unlock the power of data through ensuring that the data owner is always in control over that data everywhere it is shared. And I think in that vein, I will be something pretty controversial, and I will strike a note of optimism. So we all know that the ransomware attacks happen every 10 seconds. We know that the crisis has been brewing for 20 years. I saw it firsthand in the White House as the lead technology policy advisor pre and post September 11th. My co-founder and brother, Will Ackerly, saw some of those same challenges at the NSA, and we're seeing it day after day now. However, I think what you will hear from our esteemed panel is that there is real urgency now on the private sector to then take some of the tough steps necessary. Urgency on the part of government to better collaborate with the private sector. And you have an administration, and this is a nonpartisan issue, that is hiring the best in the world to really tackle this issue head on. And then in this EO, real muscle behind how you, with carrots and sticks, foster that collaboration, implement thoughtful zero trust strategies for how to secure data. There are no silver bullets, right? But there's a thoughtfulness about the hard work that has got to be in place. And then third, there are new approaches, new technologies and tools that can be implemented that make it much, much easier than it was even a few years ago to actually put these protections in place at the data layer. So I just wanted to strike that optimistic tone as we get into what I fully expect to be a very exciting couple of hours. The first section will be a very lively roundtable from then senior executives, all of whom have held CIO positions in the federal government, talking about the implications of the Biden administration's new executive order, and then what that means for the future. And then in the section, and then in the second section, really going into some of the practical approaches and the strategies that federal agencies and their partners can take to then put in place the mechanisms to meet the letter and the spirit of that EO effectively. And so in that spirit of optimism, it is my pleasure to then introduce my good friend, David Bray, as our moderator. And I would just say, to then embarrass him just a bit, I have known David for then a number of years, almost a decade now. And I will say he is a true cyber polymath in that he really knows policy deeply, he really knows technology deeply, and he has been a real agent of change throughout his career. And he was vital to really helping early on to then put in place best-in-class data protections. And I think part of the reason for his success is this empathy for the end user and putting the human at the center of all these solutions, at that intersection of policy, technology, and how to really implement change. And so his bio it is then easily found online, but I just wanted to kind of give that overarching view about what he brings to the table and why I am so excited about this next session with him leading the way. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Bray.
Thank you, John, for that very humbling introduction. And I want to give thanks both to you and Will. I do remember when it was about a decade ago when we first met at the NSA and had some fun conversations that seem to resonate with the things that we're facing now. So, it's interesting how you can see the future. You can try and share that future with people, and some will hear it and some will finally catch up with it. But we are here now. And so also building on your remarks about optimism, completely resonate with that. Optimists are the ones that change the future. If you're not signed up for optimism, you're not willing at least to think that you can actually play a role in shaping the future. And so this is meant to be a lively conversation. We will have the panelists discussing, but I would say for our audience and everyone participating, please chime in the chat, both with questions you might have as well as comments. We want this to be actually something that is guided by your conversation and your points. Also to remind people, this session is right now non-attribution Chatham House rule. We are recording it, however, with the goal that after the event is over, we will go to anyone who did actually discuss or raise a question or verbalize something and make sure you're okay with your remarks being shared, or if you want to have them edited and redacted for just off the record purposes only. Once we've gotten everybody's approval, we will then share this video, but this is meant to be right now a non-attribution Chatham House conversation so we can have a safe space. And then finally on the optimism part, John mentioned that we are not in the business of trying to do fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Instead, we're actually in the business of what I would say is fear, understanding, and nuance. So it's fun, not FUD, that we're out here to have today. And with that, I'd like to go to our panelists, and we are here to talk about Executive Order 14028. Nice that they actually picked numbers that were multiples of each other, but I raised that at 14028. It is a bold step forward on what the US government can do working with industry to address what we've been continuing to see in terms of both ransomware, in terms of breaches, APTs, and then there's also the challenges, of course, what we also have seen over the last 4 or 5 years, where things taken out of context, where actually some of your data is lost in terms of either email or sensitive messages, and then that's used and weaponized in ways that actually hurt organizations as well. This is really about making sure information that should still have that confidentiality, integrity, and availability is done so appropriately for the right purposes in both the public and the private sectors. And so with that, I'd like to actually go first to a well-respected friend and colleague who has done several great activities for our federal government in helping move technology forward. So Joe, if I could actually ask you the first question, why is Executive Order 14028 so important from an action-oriented standpoint? If you could just give us sort of your initial thoughts as to why it's so important and help us begin the conversation today.
Thanks, David. So I think the new EO is a great step forward. Clearly we must do more to mitigate the threats and the risks that this nation faces. I think we have a couple of fundamental challenges facing both the government and industry, and that is that we have a large attack surface, and attacking U.S. industry is pretty much risk-free, and attackers. Every ransom payment that John was mentioning, they get better technology and they can launch more attacks. And I think we need to find, they only need to find 1 or 2 critical vulnerabilities in our defenses, and they're in. And we've got to protect this incredibly large attack surface. Now, I really like what's in the EO. I think everything in there is great, but especially moving to the cloud securely, zero trust. Is great. I think industry needs to use this EO as a template for how can they better secure their environment. I think we may need to look at incentivizing industry, the private sector to adopt some more of this. But when you look at zero trust is something that is, I think, fundamental because it's going to be near impossible to keep the attackers out of everything that we have, all the infrastructure. But it says we can't trust the user's identity, the device, the software, the network, the data. It just goes on and on. We must segment out our IT infrastructure. We must also try to simplify it, and that means modernization, modernizing our systems, our networks. We also need to complete the transition to IPv6. If you look at how we get end-to-end visibility and microsegmentation, we need the IPv6. And I would say that OMB also has to rationalize all the other cyber-related orders that are out there and how they all fit together. And the last thing is supply chain. I mean, when I was on the Acquisition Security Council, and we were looking at companies, products, and services, but there's so many different combinations, and we have so many weaknesses in our supply chain. And I think we also really need to modernize our operational technology or industrial control systems, which historically have presented a vulnerability for the private sector. So I'll stop there, but it's a great start, but a lot more work to be done.
Well said, and I really appreciate, Joe, how you painted a picture that really it's a 50-mile goalpost, and all you have to do is kick it in somewhere. Like you said, I mean, there's a lot of still legacy systems that we have to move forward. Cloud is still a big issue. If I could ask you a real quick rejoinder before I go on to Essye and then Renee and then Matthew for their thoughts too. If I could ask you a real quick rejoinder, how can we go together faster? This has often been a case that individual agencies, obviously context varies and specific challenges vary, but is there something that would make more sense for how we can go there together faster, leveraging what's actually written with this new executive order?
David, I've always been a huge believer in shared services and sharing success stories and so on. So I think look at there's 23 CFO Act agencies, 91 small agencies in the government. Clearly, some have more resources than others, and I think the bigger agencies that are particularly more adapted to some of these cyber services probably need to help some others out. So if we can share services, share lessons learned, techniques, that's probably the best way to accelerate the implementation.
Well said, and I think you're absolutely right that if we can look across all and see what our exemplars, and I think we even see in the chat Kevin raising, are there organizations operating as exemplars? And I think the answer is probably going to be depending on different parts. There are certain organizations you can hold up, but from that, if we can at least incentivize them to take the time, because I know oftentimes you only have the tyranny of now for your own organization, let alone helping others. If there can be possibly some incentives built in when it comes to implementing some of this, that'll make it more likely. So with that, I'd like to go to Essye. And so Essye, similarly, you have been a tremendous positive change agent for global good and federal good across the nation. And if I can ask you a similar question, which is, in your perspective, why is this new executive order so needed and important from an action-oriented standpoint?
Well, I think Joe did a really good job of laying out the landscape of what the EO does for us. I think it's beneficial that it builds upon the previous EOs that were released. So it's not as if we're starting something new. But the big takeaway for me in this is it recognizes that protecting the nation requires more than just government input. This has to be a partnership between government and industry. And I think the EO shines a light on the need for that partnership and the information sharing. And we've done some semblance of that over the years, particularly in DoD with the DIB Cybersecurity Forum, where we gave industry partners an opportunity to talk about threats. But there always seemed to be a little bit of reluctance or barrier to companies opening kimono with everybody else around the table. And we've got to understand what those barriers are and how we help overcome that. Because we've got to look at not just the risk of government entities, but the entire ecosystem and how that plays. One of my fears is we've always had or taken a lot of flack for establishing the bar too high for entry to do business with the government. It shouldn't be on us to lower the barrier of entry. It should be our responsibility to make sure our partners in industry and across agencies understand what the high standards are to protect the data and to assure mission assurance. And I think we get lost in that sometimes, just focused on how do we bring folks in to do business with the government? I'm sorry, there's a price to pay for that. And there's a price to make sure that the nation is protected, and we cannot lose sight of that. One of the things that I don't want to say it's a disappointment, but I wish the EO had gone a little bit further into, it briefly mentions OT. Mm-hmm. And to Joe's point, we've got to delve deeper into how do we address industrial control systems. What's that gold standard of sense that we need to look for to make sure everything we tie to the infrastructure is protected and built to a certain level? So I think we've got to dig a little bit deeper there, but this all comes back to accountability. What are we all responsible for as partners in this broad ecosystem to protect the data, to protect the mission, and to make sure we can operate not only from an interoperability aspect, but securely as we cross lines across organizations.
Well said. And I really liked how you once said that there's, this is a continuance of the executive order. So this is not de novo, it's really just a continuing in the narrative. I really like the point that you also made about, thinking about the defense industrial base and how we actually could possibly sort of draw some lessons from that. And that there is a barrier. I mean, there's not a barrier, but there is a level in which we expect you to be able to come in. And if you're not doing that justification, or if you're not able to demonstrate those bona fides, then it's something that we need to actually have industry spend the time doing, because there is a lot of weighing on these government systems and these federal systems. And then finally mentioning OT. And if I could ask you a rejoinder on the OT part, because obviously we've had the Colonial Pipeline attack. We've also just had most recently JBS with the food system. It does seem to be that for whatever reason, either just solely for money or maybe other money and geopolitical purposes, critical infrastructure is being targeted. Is there something that we can pull from this as sort of like short-term steps that we should be thinking about that government agencies can do, possibly with other sector partners, to think about OT and what's just happened recently with the Colonial Pipeline and JBS?
David, I'm big on the basics and the hygiene. And we've had this conversation over the years regarding the network and just basic hygiene, blocking and tackling. I think we've got to start there with the industrial control systems as well. We're so focused on the network, and we've got to broaden that aperture, that it's not just about the traditional, servers and computers. It really is about every endpoint that's out there, no matter what it looks like. And what's the measure of merit for those things as we bring them in? So I'm maybe too basic, but I think we got to go back to hygiene and broaden our definition.
Oh, I wish I could do a hallelujah to what you're saying. I agree enthusiastically that, if anything, this distinction between IT and OT was an artificial one to begin with, especially as things get more and more connected. And so we need to embrace that in this decade ahead, it's about any device that's electronic. Assume that at some point in time, even if you don't intend for it to be connected to a network, it might, and therefore it needs to have good hygiene. So that is very well said. And that's a good segue, I think, now to also a longtime good friend and colleague, Renee. Renee, in your thoughts, if you could give us the take on the executive order and what might be opportunities to help accelerate its actual implementation, I'd be interested in your thoughts there.
Yeah, so it's the tough to follow Joe and Essye, but sort of a couple of different things in this one. And I want to add a framing exercise with this, right? We all, whether we like it or not, depend on our United States federal government. It protects our borders, whether you like it or not. It protects our food supply. USDA grade means what to us? And, all the way up to the stack to the history of our country, especially on the heels of Memorial Day, where men and women have sacrificed their lives for our way of life. Whether you agree with my statements or not, let's reframe it. So why should we set the bar higher working with the federal government? Because in the end, the federal government is supposed to work for you and in its way protect democracy, and certainly the first 10 amendments called the Bill of Rights. So if if you don't want to play that game, then don't play that game. All right, I get that. Now I'll put an asterisk and say, if you're going to provide critical infrastructure, it's a really different game and you're going to play it because thousands of people depend upon you. But let's put that over to the side and all of that. So I did want to reframe it a little bit, right? Is why should you pay the price to the federal government? Because the federal government pays its price, and it pays its price with lives. And so, my hat's off to all of those that have served, and all of those who have family members who have served, and to those that have not come home from the beginning of the history of this country. So let's just begin with my framing is I love the Constitution and I love national security. I signed up, I took my oath, and that's what I will defend it to defend it to the end. And so if I reframe it, I agree that executive order was a culmination of several executive orders, and it's just the evolution that we are on. And what I really liked, there are dates and there are people named, not just by 30 days, each agency will do this. It's by 60 days, these two agencies will do X so that the agencies themselves, the government, can do X, Y, and Z. And so it showed the progression of what needs to happen in order to convert an executive order into action. So I really liked that part. And David, you've already hit on that as well. Then the pieces I really liked, and I do think there are gaps in what was written, was the sharing of threat information. This usually then raises the flag, well, I need my clearance and everything else. Well, you actually don't. if you've watched some James Bond, if you watch sci-fi, all of that stuff comes true. And many of it is built on truth. Hunt for Red October. I'm just going back in history, not picking anything current, right? If you can imagine it, it can happen, and it does happen. So you can tell stories to the people that are running missions in the federal government. You can tell stories to our vendor community and say, this is the art of possible. And, you can kind of say, and I'm telling you because I've actually, read some things about the art of possible. So threat sharing is critical, and you don't need a clearance to tell stories about the art of possible. And I want to make it so people will be open to say, it is a privilege and a responsibility to have that kind of credentials. So let's be careful about who gets it. We've seen what happens but let's also not hold our clearances and not turn around and make a classified story, a story, non-attribution that can inspire people to do better in protecting our assets. And so believer in that sharing of information. Let's say SolarWinds. What if in 2019, SolarWinds had been told that somebody found something? And if they were able to listen, or like above the noise where there's lots of noise on a network, what we could imagine a different day than what we had with SolarWinds in the United States federal government. So that's where information sharing can go, is you also need to differentiate between what's interesting and what's important. You don't always know that, but a lot of times we get signals far enough in advance to take action. We got to tune our ears better to finding that. So the sharing of the threat information, I love the vulnerability management program. Vulnerabilities are hard. It seems so simple. Having come from operating a technology on this globe and off this globe, and by the way, we depend on satellites in our everyday life. GPS, for example, everyone uses Google Maps now that we can get out of our houses. So I would say the vulnerability management program is something near and dear to my heart. I was fortunate to have one of the best CISOs in the United States government. Probably all would say that as CIOs. But he had the foresight to say NASA needed a vulnerability management program. And I happen to have been fortunate enough to be there to help him get that started. And then to see that come true, I think really matters, because that helps to close those little pinholes that are around your network. You can have defense in depth, but pinholes will still get the backside of you. And finally, I liked having the conversation about supply chain and risk management associated with cybersecurity. They have to go hand in hand. And we talked about Internet of Things. We've talked about operational technology, your refrigerator, your garage door. You can't buy them these days that don't connect up to your home network. And so that's the same in the federal government as well. We buy refrigerators, we buy badge readers, right? And so those are on a network and they have to be protected, and they've got lots of data about individuals that are coming through the doors. So I really liked those discussions. The gap I saw, and I don't want to go too far into this, I didn't see the connection of FedRAMP into the supply chain risk management associated with hardware and software. To me, the first question is, should the government be using it? And that's a supply chain risk question. Then spend the resources on, if the answer is no, game over, you get out of the queue. And then you can start in the queue when we say, from a supply chain risk perspective, the government can take that risk on in certain situations. There'll be certain situations that you can't use certain things. That's okay. Just know the data that's going to ride the tool. But I would have liked to have seen the two of them married up, because that would help so many people. So thank you.
Very well said. Well, and I think your point is well taken, that FedRAMP and supply chains, there is a role to be played, because like you said, if we first have to decide, do we want to use it or not? And then once we use it, in what situations it makes sense. If I could build on something you were talking about the linkage of threat information and having that visibility, and that you don't have to have the full in-depth classified conversations. You can have unclassified conversations. Do we need to, as we move, and we were talking, Joe talked a little bit about this, Essye talked a little bit about this, as we move to these networks that are going to ideally go to cloud services, we need to keep in mind that we also need to have visibility with these cloud services, so we can have that big picture if something is being done to government assets. And does that then need to tie into a threat program that is not just having the classified conversations, but is able to go to industry people and say, based on what we're seeing as we're looking across the entire federal government, we're seeing odd behaviors. We're not quite sure what it is, but there's something odd going over here with this type of network or this type of system. I mean, I'd be interested in your thoughts about the linkages between cloud services and better and more real-time threat reporting as well.
Yeah, the two go hand in hand, and there is actually a constitutional issue, and this is where it's getting worked out, not only in the TIC 3.0 architecture, but the cloud providers, the major cloud providers are figuring this out as well. Is that traffic is being monitored, and the United States government can't monitor traffic without a subpoena. So cloud providers is, again, it's a different bar to the United States government. We do have to have our special lines, highways into working in the government in order not to violate the constitutional rights of other businesses, other governments. Local and state and tribal governments use these cloud providers as well. So there is a little bit of an extra expense associated with it, and the architectures need to do it. It's a partnership, and you need to have trust-based conversations about what you're seeing between each other. Anytime you do business with somebody, we're willing to do a handshake pre-COVID. We do that same handshake on the internet and the way our ecosystems are operated. So we have to be willing to have the tough conversations about what's going on in the world, in the ecosystems with that. And so you're spot on. It just needs to be done. To me, there are barriers to it. I get that there's a reputational issue with shareholding companies, but at some point, you're going to have so many reputational hits after a breach, after breach, after breach. Let's sit down and have that trust conversation, put some parameters about it, how we're going to exchange data and how we're going to exchange information when you see anomalous behaviors. So I think we can, and I think we should. I think it's already started. It's just a matter of exponentially going faster with having those conversations.
Well said, and I think, and I agree wholeheartedly for your parks. That's what's being done with the TIC 3.0. There's some promising initiatives there, and like you said, it's about rationalizing it and making sure we also do things in a constitutionally appropriate way. Go ahead.
Yeah, David, I forgot one more thing, right? So recent articles are now out regarding internet in space, and there are some really big benefits to the globe as a whole to a space-provided internet. It creates a whole different ball game and scariness and exciting new novels being presented to you around the globe for beach reading, right? Is when we go that direction, or when we start seeing success in that direction, because we have headed that direction, there's a whole new risk associated with cloud providers, pun intended. And if we can figure out what we do on terra firma, we're going to be better positioned for the risks we face in space.
Very well said, and I don't think you knew this. It was not planned for the audience, but we actually over the last year have been working on the issues of internet providing assets in space. We just released a big report that will include the link in the chat. It's called the GeoTech Commission Report, or more long form, the Commission on the Geopolitical Impacts of New Technologies and Data. Commercial space is one of the chapters. It's chapter 6, and you're absolutely right. Once you get above a certain elevation, it's technically international waters. And so whose jurisdiction did that transaction occur? And it's not like you can really send the space police up to pull the hard drive, because those things are going pretty fast at low Earth orbit. So you're absolutely right. We've got to get it right here as quickly as possible here on ground, because space-based internet, if we're not careful, could be the new dark web, and that would look really, 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 really bad. So thank you, Renee, for teeing that up. We will definitely have to invite you back. Not to mention, also would love to have you back also at the Atlantic Council on the cybersecurity of satellites, because some of those satellites don't have a lot of cybersecurity, which could be a big issue if there was a collision. So thank you. That was great. And we'll circle back. And so Matthew, you now have the hard act of following everybody else. But we'd be interested in your thoughts on both the executive order, what's promising about it, what's additional is needed, and then what are you seeing as the action steps coming forward with Executive Order 14028?
Yeah, thanks, David. So I think Joe and Essye and Renee talked a lot about what's in the EO. And they captured it pretty comprehensively, especially for a 34-page document. I think they hit everything. They didn't leave me much. So instead, I'm going to talk about what's not in the EO. And in particular, as a former OMB guy, there are no additional resources for doing any of this, right? This is a mountain of commitments and requirements for agencies, both operational lead agencies like CISA, like OMB, GSA, NIST, DoD, as well as for all of the other agencies who are going to be downstream of all these near-term 30, 60, 90-day deadlines to implement new guidance, new directives, new architectures, taking those plans for zero trust and things like that, that they're going to create, making those reality within the constraints of the normal budget and appropriation cycle. So the EO itself is incredibly comprehensive. And during my time at OMB, I don't think all of the EOs we ever worked on totaled up to 34 pages. And like right here in the first 4 months of the Biden administration, you get the whole soup, right? You get the soup and the salad and the meatball sub, and the cake for dessert. And the concerns I would have about that as someone that's in industry now, a former government executive, is if everything's important, then nothing's important, right? And all of these agencies, both those operational lead agencies I talked about, as well as the individual agencies going to be downstream of this, they only have so many people, so much time, so many resources, so much support of the vendor community to tackle any of these challenges and opportunities, because both are inherently in the EO. And if this just becomes a box checking exercise, do the minimum viable product to hit a deadline just so we can say we accomplished something and someone in the White House can check a box, that's not going to do us any good. I think if we listen to the leadership that we've heard from Joe and Essye and Renee on where the priorities are, what the real opportunities are, and where both industry and government can work together to make measurable progress, there's tremendous opportunity in the weeks and months to come. So my big issue, what I'm seeing now, when I'm talking to my members about now, what this panel is about, is great that you've got all these taskings. Great that you, like David, you mentioned that you're building on a lot of the EOs of the past to try and move this forward. There's not a lot of the de novo, just starting from scratch. But if you're trying to fix FedRAMP and fix TIC and do critical software and do supply chain, and EDR and information sharing, like it gets to be a lot. So, I would hope that the National Security Council, that OMB, that the Federal CIO Council, on which Joe and Essye and Renee all used to sit, and I used to work, that they are open and communicative as much as possible with industry, right? Not just a roundtable here and there, not just a panel here and there, but what is that? What is that drumbeat of dialogue and collaboration and questions getting answered and opportunities being filtered up, where the government's going to be listening to the industry partners? Because at the end of the day, the government's going to be in charge of all of this, but industry is going to be supporting the vast majority of it, right? And if we keep this sort of behind closed doors, whether it's classified or not, to Renee's point, that doesn't do any of us any good, right? And so, my hope is that this administration, the Build Back Better agenda, what they're trying to push for, that they spend as much time, pardon the contractors in the back, they spend as much time working with industry and prioritizing the input and expertise that we have on the outside as they do talking amongst themselves and having those meetings where they shuttle back and forth to the White House to go over the most recent PowerPoint slides. I mentioned this earlier, but the resources piece is critical. So, and most folks on this Zoom probably know it, the process by which the EO came out and the process by which the budget came out were two very different trains running very different tracks that never crossed, right? And so they both get released at the same time, but they don't talk to each other, right? There's very little connection, right? And of course, CISA, GSA, others got money in the American Rescue Plan, right? They've got some leftover CARES Act money and omnibus money to do some of this. But a lot of these other agencies, even though there were some small cybersecurity budget plus ups and some actually pretty decent IT budget plus ups in the 22 budget, that money is not there right now for these agencies to take immediate necessary action. So if you're thinking about implementation as this goes forward, it's short-term steps, and then there's the long-term budget implementation. What is the NSC and OMB and the White House going to do in that middle part? Right? How are they going to ensure that there's no continuity lost between these quick hit actions and then the longer term changing the trajectory and the partnership and the collaboration and the visibility that we need inside and outside of government networks to drive better outcomes and better cybersecurity, hygiene, and performance across the board?
Very well said, and you're absolutely right. The budget cycle and the EO were separate paths; they didn't cross, and so that's both an opportunity but also a challenge. And so, if I could ask you, Matthew, given your expertise, we assume budget sweeps will happen around July or August for agencies and departments. If there were sweeps and if there were funds available, could you what would be your initial thoughts as to what might be things we might want to put that sweep to at least get the biggest bang for the buck we can in this remaining fiscal year before we plunge into the next fiscal year ahead?
Yeah, David, it's a great question. I think the sweeps piece is critically important. The one thing I'll say before I get to the sweeps is there's nothing that's stopping the administration from coming out with a cybersecurity supplemental, right? I mean, now that the budget's out, nothing is stopping them other than political will.
Congress.
from putting forward an additional set of priorities and potentially unfunded mandates related to the EO, right? And I get the optics of that. I get the politics. I get the executive branch, legislative branch trade-off. But I do think it's important that as part of that implementation strategy, it's okay for the administration to say the threats continue to evolve exponentially, and so our ability to respond requires additional resources and commitments from Congress and from the public purse to do this, right? If everything is infrastructure now, then surely digital infrastructure and cybersecurity infrastructure is important. So let's get on that, and we would be happy to work with the administration on detailing out those priorities. On the sweeps piece, my assumption is that the administration is going to push really hard to get more folks into the cloud that aren't there. I think that's some low-hanging fruit. It's also incredibly important. I think the EDR work, the endpoint data remediation, endpoint detection remediation is going to be critically important. Some of the vulnerability management stuff that I think Renee talked about earlier is important. And I would, for agencies that have the authority to do it, for the regulatory community, I can imagine some of that money going towards stronger partnerships and pilots and collaboration opportunities with those critical infrastructure operators, because I think, as you mentioned this, you can't just leave them on an island anymore. It's like they need the resources, they need the collaboration. We have to pull them closer to the government to ensure that information is being shared, and that the connectivity between public and private sector is appropriately secured. So those are a few things that I'll be looking forward to. And then the longer term stuff is going to be on zero trust. What to do with information sharing? I think there are plenty of private sector companies that would share information with the government, but they don't want to do it 40 different ways in 40 different contracts with 40 different bureaus, components, and Marine Mammal Commission, you name it, right? So
right.
If the administration is serious about this, they'll figure out how to take whatever information they can get shared, put it somewhere where it can be actioned by the government and presented back out to industry, and where the government can also be trusted to take steps it needs to take when that information is in its hands. So those are a few things I'll be looking forward to.
Very well said. And I liked how you recommended, again, focus on trying to move to cloud. I mean, at least what I saw from a GEO report 2 years ago was it was still only 11% of agencies that had actually made the steps. So there's huge efforts to be done there. Thinking about endpoint security. And then I really liked how you said about, let's not ask them to share information 14 or 40 different ways. Let's try to have a place where you go to for it, where then it can be used across the government effectively. So really appreciate that, Matthew. And I'm now going to go to, so Essye, if I could ask you at first, this is not happening in a vacuum. Not only are we dealing with these increased attacks and these advanced persistent threats and ransomware, we're also coming out of a pandemic. So there's that, and trying to get, not just getting people back to work, but also thinking about how we help the public get back to work and everything like that. So I'd be interested as we move forward in getting back the federal government to work and also the nation back to work with COVID-19, how might CIOs and CISOs think about this? And then I'd also be interested in your thoughts as we move forward from this. How can we get actually the heads of agencies to care about this too? So it's not just seen as that's IT's job. And so I'm going to go first to Essye for that, then Joe and Renee and Matthew for your thoughts there as well.
David, I think we all probably spent countless hours going into the pandemic to make sure people, processes, and technology were in place as we pushed folks out to work remotely. I don't know that I see that very different as we bring people back in, because it should be seamless anyway. Where I am physically shouldn't hamper how I do business on a day-to-day basis. So I think the continued focus should be making sure that we're keeping folks current on the tools and the technologies that they use, and that the people understand the role that they play here as well. Because we have a tendency to talk about technology and the weaknesses there. That first entry is the person, the individual. And we need to make sure folks maintain a level of education around what they're doing and the type of business that they're doing and where there are opportunities to expose I call it the ecosystem to emerging threats. So we've got to make sure we keep our focus there. But I also think the continued focus on data, understanding where our high value assets are, how we protect our data, and how we drive continued mission assurance. I don't want to see us get so locked down in locking everything down, but making sure we can still deliver, because every agency has a different mission. And we've got to make sure where those missions fit in the priority of things. Because the things that we do within DoD, while there's commonality, very different than some of the things Renee did with SBA. And we've got to understand where those distinctions are and where there are opportunities to partner as well. But I think the key is to make sure that the workforce has what they need, and that there is no variation between what they have at home or working remotely, I should say, and in the office.
Very well said. And I think that's a good segue in terms of thinking about data. If I could build on what Essye said and go to you, Joe, and data, is there a need for trusted data? And then also there was a question that was just asked by Divya in the chat about interoperability in data. And so maybe if we could take that same question as we come out of this pandemic, and we also build upon this executive order, what can agencies be doing so they don't just focus on the infrastructure, recognizing digital infrastructure is important, but they also think about trusted data, sensitive data, interoperable data? I'd be interested in your thoughts there, Joe.
Yeah, thanks, David. As a former chief data officer, certainly I understand the importance of data, and I think, as he mentioned, high value assets. And in a perfect world, we would apply all of the best security controls, all of the best technologies to all of our data sets. But I think one of the things that Matthew mentioned, there's no additional dollars here, is there's a huge installed base within the federal government, and big corporations are facing the same thing. So how do you deploy your relatively scarce resources? And I think one of the things is to identify your highest value assets. There's a whole new field emerging of actually quantifying that. I know that when I did it in the government, it was essentially a qualitative analysis. We get a lot of smart people together. We look at all of our big data sets and determine, okay, these are the ones that are going to get a little extra attention. But I also think that this asymmetric kind of world, who would have thought, the pipeline, the meat production, and those kind of things would be attacked. I think we probably need to look at it from maybe a different perspective, bring some different thinking in there to determine what might be attacked next. I think also, if I could just comment a little bit, David, about some of the things that Matthew brought up a lot of the challenges. And I think challenges extend well beyond the data. When I look at, threats can originate in the software, the hardware, and with the user. And to me, the software is the one that's, I think, is most problematic. We really need to be pushing the, DevSecOps approach, but we also need to be looking at securing that whole software pipeline from a lifecycle perspective, because I tried to look at, we're going to go back and reassess every time we change the software, but you don't have enough resources to do that. So you have to trust what comes out of your software development, and to do that really requires a different way of looking at security from that perspective. I think you asked about the CISOs and the executives. Well, we need to be upskilling and expanding the skills of our entire cyber workforce, but everybody else as well. Everybody, all the C-suite needs to have a understanding that if you don't put enough resources to cyber, bad things are going to happen. And I'll just say that with the cloud provides a huge opportunity to accelerate change, digital transformation, provide additional security, but it doesn't guarantee security. Misconfigurations occur, inadequate change controls occur, insufficient ICAM, poor key management, and insider threats all contribute to security lapses, even when you're in the most secure cloud environment. I just think that there's a lot that we have to do. And I'd just say finally, given that I worked the last 6 years in the Department of Justice, I know how much Department of Justice is going after these bad guys that are, whether they're in Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, whatever. But I think we need to continue looking at all the possible ways to deter this criminal behavior. That may mean accelerating, going after the money, criminal prosecutions, active defense by other agencies, diplomatic efforts, just anything that could deter this behavior. Because I think, as said in the opening comments, we're seeing ransomware attacks that are just occurring continuously now. So thank you.
Very well said, Joe. Yes, and the stats are, I think it was 2 years ago, it was an individual or organization was impacted every 20 seconds. Last year, it's now every 10 seconds. I'm sure this year will be only worse. You look at the bounties that were asked in 2019, it was about, the average bounty was $7,000 that was being asked. A year later, it was up to $83,000. Just a year ago, it's now shy of 230,000. So we are not doubling. We are doing some interesting, more geometric progression. So you're absolutely spot on that we need to think about deterrence. And I can remember a conversation back in 2010. Do we need to have the equivalent of 500 or 5,000 fake grandmas, which have accounts and have credit cards with them? And if they get compromised, that lets us know that something's being done to try and target them. But I raise that as you're absolutely spot on about the need to think about deterrence. And so, Renee, if I could ask you to also think about, as we're coming out of COVID-19, if I could ask you sort of a question that Joe hinted on and Essye did as well. There's a lot of existing infrastructure. And how do we make this so this is more of an opportunity for industry versus, oh no, they're going to get off that legacy system X and it's going to take away my install base? How can we bring along industry and say you can be a part of this versus them all of a sudden saying, batten down the hatches, there's no need to get off this legacy system? And you're muted, sorry.
There we go. So let's do that. So yeah, now I'm laughing. So I felt like I was the queen of legacy systems. And grateful for those legacy systems with Voyager, 12 million miles, maybe something like that from this lovely planet, maybe even more. That's a legacy system. The baby's not coming back for a new operating system. But yet we're still getting great data with them. So to me, I'm like you, everything's an opportunity. Yeah, change is hard because boy, in a given day, you'd love something to be easy. I used to joke when I'd get to school, well, the only part of control of my day has been done. I chose my shoes and what I'm going to wear for the day. And now I'm completely out of control and at your mercy of what needs to be done in a given day. And I offer that as a backdrop because a lot of people think keeping it the same is the way to go. And it seems easier to remain the same, but it's actually harder to remain the same because you have to tell everybody they're wrong. And so you have to think of creative ways to tell people that they're wrong. And you have to have this protective mindset. And that's not problem solving. And so to me, I like to think of it as, okay, it's just another problem to be solved, which we as humans have instinctively done for thousands of years. And so it's better to play to the human instinct by saying, this is great. And this legacy system can be upgraded. There really are. There's beautiful legacy that's doing its job and there's not much we can do about it. So let's not spend a whole lot of time trying to figure that out. There are things you need to figure out with it. I'm not saying it's a no, but let's focus on how do we iterate systems development? How do we bring in systems development and fix our legacies as we go along instead of taking them as this big giant project to get done and then 10 years later it's finished. It's an iterative process. And so I play to people's egos for mindset. I play to their creativity and their innovation and say, why not be part of something bigger than yourself? Most people do that. And let's figure out how to do it. The customized software, which is usually where you get those cold dead finger analogies all the time. And yeah, they're holding on to something, but you want to give them something else to hold on to, right? Don't just rip it from the grass, give them that next thing to hold on to. And now you've got this balance, and then eventually the other hand joins the other one over in the newer space. And so jobs as CIOs is very human oriented. I got to be a good storyteller. You got to be able to take the hits pretty hard. I was yelled at and told that the reason NASA couldn't hire scientists was because of me. I was like, well, that gives me a lot more power than I actually have. But now we can open the conversation because at least they're yelling at me right now. So storyteller, collaborator, risk-based decision-making. And with that storytelling is you are your first and foremost, your job as an educator. And my final word of advice in all of this is never let a good crisis go to waste. And you can read all about several good crises that we've all had here on this screen and how we turned those into opportunities. So if you can't do it one way, you've always got this other opportunity. And so it's just time to make that happen.
Very well said. And I really appreciate what you were channeling there, which is CIO is, you know, people think it's about technology. It's like, no, that's probably 20% of our job. 80% is the human and dealing with whatever comes your way. You have a plan, but of course the day will unfold as expected. And I really liked your remarks as a fellow digital diplomat and human flak jacket as well. So that was a good underscore, Renee. So Matthew, one last question for you before we go to the lightning round, which is again, building on this. If I could ask, so as we come out of this pandemic, we've talked a little bit about what we need to do about data, what we need to do about interoperability, deterrence, and what we need to do about motivating within government. What can we do on the industry side? You know, oftentimes you see the report cards for government agencies. You don't see report cards per se for industry, but is that something where maybe if someone does get an A for their agency or they get an A in some part of it, you could actually say, and currently using the following suite of industry tools. So it's not an endorsement, but it's also maybe saying, industry, you have a stake in this game as much as the government workers that are trying to make this happen.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's a great point, David. And one of the problems I always found, especially when I was at OMB and other agencies before that, is the government does a really bad job of market research, right? They just don't. And it's not because people are like trying to be bad at it. It's just contracting officers, in a lot of cases, technical representatives don't have enough time, right? They've got tons of priorities, tons of constraints, you know, tons of objectives that they're solving for in real time. So that being said, I'm not sure what the answer is here, but there does have to be a better way of understanding what good tech is and what good cyber is. You know, I think we know we know some of the good technologies when we see them, right? You know, I would be remiss if I didn't point out, you know, we've got great encryption tools out there that folks can use to help. But, you know, there's a lot of these companies, especially these non-traditional companies. I know Essye talked about not lowering the bar to let industry in, but having industry come up to the high bar that the government has set. We've got a lot of interesting, innovative companies that are not your traditional vendor base or the DIB base that are trying to get into government. And so we really have to balance what's true innovation and what can be useful in the hands of the right people, whether they're CIOs, whether they're frontline staff, whether they're program staff, and versus what the vendor community that already has close relationships with the government wants to sell them and wants them to be able to use, right? So from an industry standpoint, I think we've got to do a better job of educating the government customer, treating them like a customer the way that you would, you know, any customer in private industry where you're trying to, you know, maintain a profit. But we've got to do a better job of educating agencies. We've got to cut out some of these middlemen that only let agencies use what the middleman is comfortable with or what they're getting a cut on. Because at the end of the day, we've got to have the best technology in the hands of the best people trained to use it inside government. There's only so much that services vendor base, that's the traditional wraparound agencies, can or should do for that matter. And then one final point I want to make on this, because we talk about people a lot, and I think, you know, Renee did a great job of detailing the need for better talent across agencies, right? Better folks in IT shops, CISO shops, program offices. We also need really strong technical leadership at the political level. And so one of the things that I've been pushing for, and our organization ADI has been pushing for, one of the things I hope to see, we need to get the administration and Congress to get moving on getting nominations in place to make things happen, because you can have all the best ideas in the EO, but if you don't have political leadership there, those things tend to fall by the wayside. So we need Jen Easterly at CISA. We need Robin Carnahan at Essye. We need Chris Inglis as the National Cyber Director. You know, we need someone at NIST. We need OMB to get a nominee to come run the budget, right? I mean, the fact that a budget went out without an OMB director is its own indictment. That's another roundtable. But but you know, we got to have those people at the top, because they are the ones that motivate and hold folks below them accountable, and are also accountable to those above them at the White House or in the heads of the departments and agencies. And you know, if we can see more action happen there, I think it's going to lead to better outcomes, regardless of what the deadlines say in the EO.
Very well said. And on that note, Matthew, again, not planned or scripted on our part, but one of the things that we are working with, and we'd be happy to work with you and others on, is for folks coming in, both with the new administration and also folks in Congress that do not have a background in some of these things that we've been talking about. Longtime friend, director and professor Jerry Meckling, who led the Leadership for Network World program at Harvard, is actually going to be working with us to try and make that available to CIOs, make that available to other leaders as well. So we'd be happy to sort of have you all come back, because there are lessons to be learned that at least we can do new lessons incurred, as opposed to repeating the same lessons that were done over the last decade. But I really like what you said, Matthew, about how we can move forward together and how it does require not just those in government that are nonpartisan in nature, but we do need to recognize the need for political leadership too. Otherwise, we're missing a very important part of the equation. All right, so we've got about 4 minutes left. So I'm going to go to each of you and give 1 minute, probably 2 tweet length recommendations. I'm going to go first to Matthew, then I'm going to go to Renee, then to Joe, and then to Essye to bring it home for us. Give us 2 action-oriented steps, tweet length recommendations that you would recommend that we move forward to make this happen. Matthew, you first.
Yeah, thanks, David. So the first thing is for the EO, whatever's going to happen immediately or in the near term, we got to have plans first, action second, resources right alongside, right? Like that's really the thing. Plans are just one step, right? And of course, all of these, every journey begins with the single step, but we can't let planning beget more planning and not allow action to happen. So, turning plans into action is going to be incredibly important. The second thing I'll say, and I'll just double back on what I said earlier, is we've got to have better political leadership, and then we've got to quit treating cybersecurity and technology issues as if they are only the issues of CIOs and CISOs, right? Every person in every agency is a responsible technology and security actor, and we need to do a better job of getting them real training that does real good and get real skills in their hands so that they can be more effective in their job, both defending against malicious activity that might be happening, as well as delivering the mission that they're there to do through better technology and security.
Very well said, and I agree with you enthusiastically. We cannot leave IT and cybersecurity to just a few. Otherwise, then we're going to be always pushing up against other priorities of the day. So with that, Renee, similar question for you. What would be 2 tweet length recommendations on how we move forward? Oh, and you're muted. Sorry.
So you don't get back. There we go. Because I got locusts, I got cicadas right out the window, and they drive me crazy. I don't want to do that to you guys. So yes, and to what Matthew said, and my 2 things are this, is that we need to turn the equation around. Business or agency losses and expenses associated with cyber incidences have to be more costly than implementing good practices. So you can do that with internal government very easily. Now the laws need to be changed to fine companies, especially those running critical infrastructure, that should they make it so forces people to put gasoline in plastic bags, then they ought to pay more of a fine, because they provided Facebook and all the other social medias with very concerning videos. So the one is let's make it cheaper to do the right thing, whether you're a business or working in the federal government. And the other thing is let's connect the supply chain risk cyber aspects to the FedRAMP process and go make great things happen together.
Well said, and I agree with you enthusiastically. Let's make sure the incentives are in place to do the right thing from the start. Be aware of, if you don't, there are costly second and third order, including misinformation, disinformation effects. And also, again, not planned on our part, but if we'll send in a link in the chat, the GeoTech Center's commission report, Chapter 4 is all about supply chains and thinking about how do we actually advance supply chains. So Joe, you're next. 2 tweet length recommendations for how we move forward from this.
I think we're going to see emerging technology solutions that will protect against a lot of these ransomware attacks. But I also think that all of these new emerging technologies will present new opportunities for the bad guys, right? So we need to be thinking about what do future cyber attacks look like now and in the future. Quantum computing will, I think, eventually render our current encryption useless. AI-powered cyber attacks may occur. I don't even know what that would look like, but I don't want to go up against an AI-powered attack. And I also, I mean, two things I wonder about, David, if it's time, and that is, can the CSPs, the big CSPs, do more from, with respect to the apps that are running in their environment? Clearly, they have a lot more resources than some of the government agencies do. The other is it time to start thinking about redesigning TCP/IP? We can go broader implementation of HIP, and I've even heard some people looking at blockchain, maybe treating the whole internet as a massive ledger. But these are things I think may be the right time. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Well said, and you're hitting everything that we're passionate about. Thinking one about quantum resistant algorithms. We do have Vint Cerf as a commissioner, so even he says you can look at, there's a thing called Quick, that's just one example, but there are things that are needed to upgrade TCP/IP. And as one who has endured 22 million comments that seem to be 18 million of which were bot submitted, yes, AI can do things that will mess with you, and it makes your life interesting is all I can say. All right, so Essye, you get to bring it home for us. So what would be your two recommendations on how we move forward?
We think about this more than a technology discussion, and we look at it through a mission lens, because the things that are happening today will drive us to change the way we do business. And we've got to be open to that change and balance that with protecting ourselves. Number one. Number two, and we've said it, government and industry collaboration is key to success here. We have to build on those trusted relationships so that we're comfortable working with each other and moving forward. And then finally, a plug for NIST. We've not talked a lot about them, but we can't miss an opportunity, especially our industry partners, to help us shape the controls and the architectures that we put in place, which will potentially drive us to innovation. The NIST Center for Cyber Center of Excellence is a great opportunity for our industry partners to bring in their innovative ideas and products. Let's not miss those opportunities.
Very well said, and I think you're absolutely right. NIST works best when it's actually being informed by industry, so that way government can use the best across the entire departments and agencies that are out there. So well said, Essye. Thank you, Essye, Renee, Joe, Matthew, for a stupendous panel. This has been a great conversation. Thank you again to our audience for this. I'm now going to hand the mic off to Connie LaSalle and Will Ackerly for the second part of this conversation. But I will say again, as we always try to encourage here at the Atlantic Council, please be bold, please be brave, and please be benevolent for the future ahead.